When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Hello Caleb. User: The King 2. Posted September 27th, 1996.
There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from making people happy for a living. Not the glamorous kind, not the kind you can dress up into something noble. I mean the kind that comes from miles on the road, cheap rooms, and applause that disappears the moment the lights come up. You learn to carry it quietly. You learn to tell yourself this is fine, that this is life. I'd been doing Elvis long enough that the act felt welded to me. The hair, the grin, the way people leaned forward when the band hit the first note. I wasn't fooling anyone into thinking I was the king, but I gave them something close enough to remember for a while. That counted for something, or at least that's what I told myself when the pay was thin and the drives were long. I was headed to a convention outside Dallas, the kind of corporate thing where they want nostalgia without risk. They'd pay me a few $100s and a free meal and send me on my way. I stayed at a motel off the highway, outside a small Texas town that looked like it had stopped asking questions decades ago. One-story, flickering sign, office that smelled like old smoke and cleaning fluid. The room was exactly what I expected. A patterned bedspread meant to hide stains, curtains that didn't quite meet, an air conditioner that rattled like it was thinking about quitting. The TV was bolted into a wooden cabinet, old enough to feel permanent. I set my bag down and stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the building. Motel rooms always feel borrowed, like you're occupying space that doesn't care if you're there or not. I ate a cold burger from the place next door, checked my jumpsuit for missing stones, and ran through my set list in my head. Same songs, same order, same smiles at the same beats. It worked, and that was the point. Around 11:30, I turned on the TV just for noise. Static-heavy channels, infomercials, a preacher promising salvation for a donation. I let it run while I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. But at exactly midnight, the picture warped. Every channel did it once, too. The sound dipped into a low hum, and the screen snapped to the same image no matter where I turned the dial. A folding table sat in the middle of a cheap set, a Texas flag hanging crooked behind it. The lighting was harsh and unforgiving. A man sat behind the table in a plain button-down shirt, smiling politely at the camera. Blocky text crawled along the bottom of the screen. Welcome to Late Night Line. Call in and talk about your future. I told myself this was local access. Had to be. Somebody's passion project. Nothing unusual. Then the man leaned forward slightly and spoke. "Good evening," he said. "If you're watching from a room you didn't plan to sleep in, you're right on time." I flipped the channel. Same show. Flipped again. Same man, same smile, same two bright lights. Even the static channels showed him now. He waited until I stopped flipping and said, conversationally, "That won't work tonight." I sat back on the bed, the remote loose in my hand. The host took a sip from a mug and nodded like we were already in the middle of a conversation. He talked about people who tell themselves the road is temporary, just one more gig, one more town, one more year before they stop and become who they were supposed to be. His voice stayed calm, reasonable, like he was offering advice rather than accusation. "You do a good job," he said. "You give people something familiar, something safe. You've been doing it long enough that you started to forget what you wanted before it all worked." The crawl at the bottom changed. "Hello, Caleb." Nobody in Texas knew that name. On stage, I had a name that sounded smooth and borrowed. Caleb belonged to a version of me that existed before the jumpsuit, before strangers loved the idea of Elvis more than they ever loved me. The host smiled wider, like he'd finally said the right thing. "You've been running from that name," he said gently. "Not because you hate it, because you don't know who it belongs to anymore." I tried to stand, but my legs hesitated. The air in the room felt wrong, swinging between too warm and too cold, like the building couldn't decide how to hold me. The host kept talking, explaining why I love the king, not the rhinestones or the songs, but the transformation. Nobody becoming everything, disappearing into something larger than life and never having to come back. "That's what you've been trying to do," he said. "Not become Elvis, become untouchable." The crawl changed again. "You know what you did." A memory pressed at the edges of my thoughts, something I'd sealed away so long ago that I'd convinced myself it belonged to someone else. The host didn't rush me. He watched with patient interest, then said, "You're not on the road because you love it. You're on the road because standing still means looking directly at what you avoided." Then he said simply, "There's a man in the next room." Once he said it, I noticed the thinness of the walls, the way sound traveled too easily in places like this. I could hear it then, uneven breathing through the wall, slow and heavy. The host explained the man's pattern calmly: drinking, sleeping, waking angry, hurting someone sooner or later. "You understand men like that," he said. "You spent your life around them." The crawl changed one last time. "Do something about it." I shook my head and said no out loud, but my voice didn't sound convincing. The host didn't seem offended. He talked about responsibility, about moments where a person finally gets to matter. He framed it gently as a chance rather than a demand. I understood then that this wasn't about saving anyone. It was about choice, about whether I would cross a line and call it meaning. The crawl stopped moving. "Get up." I stood there for a long, time, listening to the breathing through the wall, feeling the night press in. I didn't know if the show was real or if the motel was sick or if my mind had finally given out. I turned the volume down until the host's voice became a murmur, and I walked to the door, put my hand on the handle, and
Subject, Shift After Shift, Part 2. User, RNGogo459. Posted, August 28, 1998.
the code ended the way codes always do when they end badly, without ceremony. The room went quiet in stages, urgency draining away piece by piece until only the low, indifferent sound of the monitor remained and the soft movements of people shifting back into routine. Someone wrote the time down. Someone reached for the sheet. Someone said his name aloud as if that might anchor him to the bed a little longer. I stepped back when there was no longer anything useful for my hands to do, and the sensation that had been pressing on me since the alarm first sounded did not lift. It settled instead, heavy and unresolved, like a thought that refused to finish itself. What unsettled me wasn't that Hollis had died. Death was familiar. I had watched it arrive too many times to count. What unsettled me was that nothing about it surprised me. Every movement of that code had unfolded exactly as it already existed in my mind, from the first jolt of movement to the brief, useless flicker of hope and the attending's quiet decision to stop. I had been inside that moment before my body ever moved, and standing there afterward, I couldn't convince myself it had only been imagination. That should have been enough to frighten me into silence, enough to make me distrust every sensation that followed. Instead, something else crept in behind the fear, quieter and more dangerous. If I could see it coming, why couldn't I change it? The question followed me as the unit reset itself around me, efficient and indifferent. Another patient was rolled into the same bed before Hollis's body had even left the department. Supplies were replaced. The floor was wiped. The ER erased him the way it erased everyone, and I kept working as if nothing inside me had shifted. I tried to bury myself in routine, checking vitals, hanging medications, writing notes by hand at the station with deliberate care. I reminded myself of what exhaustion does to perception, how caffeine blurs judgment, how the mind reaches for patterns when it's pushed too far. But those explanations felt thin now, like excuses I no longer fully believed. The déjà vu hadn't been vague or dreamlike. It had been specific, insistent, and early enough to act on. The next fold came quietly. I was standing at the nurse's station, scanning the board, when the air seemed to compress and sharpen. Sounds separated instead of blending together, and I became acutely aware of small details I usually ignored. The certainty followed immediately and without negotiation. Bed 5 was going to decline. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the slow, treacherous way that slips past until it's too late to recover. Patient in bed 5 was a man in his late 60s with long-standing lung disease, admitted for shortness of breath. He was stable enough to be overlooked, upright in bed, breathing carefully, apologetic in that quiet way people get when illness has followed them for years. In my mind, I saw him later, his breathing shallower, his numbers sliding while everyone assumed he was holding steady. I saw the moment when concern would finally break through, arriving just after the point where I could help. Alongside that image came something new, though, something that hadn't been there before, not just the outcome, but a deviation, a small change, a different decision, a medication administered earlier in a way that felt right and inevitable in the version unfolding behind my eyes. The conviction attached itself to the idea with the same weight as the others, and this time I did not dismiss it. I told myself this was why it was happening. Hollis had been too far gone by the time the fold came, his course already set. This was different. This was earlier. This was something I could affect. I reviewed his chart again, slower than necessary, searching for a reason to stop myself, for a clear line I couldn't cross. My thoughts felt unnervingly clear, the usual noise receding as it had been turned down. I prepared the medication carefully, checking the dose more than once, allowing space for doubt to surface. It didn't. Nurses made judgment calls every shift. Experience mattered, and I had years of it. I told myself I wasn't acting recklessly, only decisively, and that distinction mattered more to me than it should have. In the room, the patient watched me with tired eyes as I explained what I was doing in neutral, practical terms. I avoided listening too closely to my own voice, unwilling to give hesitation room to grow. The medication went in without issue, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. Relief came fast and disorienting, the sensation of alignment returning as if I'd finally stepped onto the correct path. But then, his breathing changed. Not easing, but tightening. Colors spread unevenly across his neck and chest, his expression shifting from weary to alarmed. The realization arrived immediately and without mercy. This was not the version I had seen. This was worse. I called for help, the words automatic now, and the room filled with motion as oxygen was increased and additional medications were administered. The sense of inevitability returned, heavier than before, and every intervention seemed to push against a body that had already decided to reject them. The code that followed felt unreal, like watching myself move through a scene I no longer controlled. Protocol took over, rigid and precise, but it did not matter. When it ended, the silence that followed felt differently from the one after Hollis. This death didn't carry mystery or inevitability. It carried cause. Questions were asked, calmly and without accusation. What had changed? What had been given? And when? I answered evenly, my voice steady in a way that felt disconnected from the weight gathering inside me. The chart told a story that could be explained, a reaction that fell within the wide margins of medicine. No one raised their voice, and no one blamed me, but I knew what I had done. I stepped into the hallway afterward and leaned against the wall beneath the buzzing lights, the repetition returning slowly, deliberately. And that was when understanding settled in, heavy and unavoidable. The deja vu hadn't been showing me how to save anyone. It had been showing me the cost of believing I could. It hadn't been punishing me for following protocol or doing my job. It had waited until I stepped outside the lines, until I trusted the certainty more than the system I was meant to uphold. The realization came without drama, and it was worse for that. This wasn't a gift or a warning, it was a test. It wanted agency. It wanted me to choose, and once I did, the responsibility became personal and permanent. I thought of my children asleep at home, trusting the world to keep turning while I worked through the night. I thought of my husband in his chair, insulated from consequence by unconsciousness. I thought of how easily the ER erased people once they were gone, leaving only paperwork behind. And the fold came again, faint but unmistakable, another preview pressing at the edges of my awareness. I pushed away from the wall and walked back toward the noise of the unit, my steps measured. I understood now that the repetition wasn't going to stop and that the temptation to intervene would only grow stronger. The ER rewarded action, not restraint, and whatever had learned how to fold time inside my head understood that far better than I ever had.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.